Along the ocean shoreline, almost anywhere in the world, we can encounter the unique environments called estuaries, those water passages created as rivers complete their journeys back to the sea. Saltwater and freshwater are mixed together in estuaries. And with the fluctuation of the tides, organisms living in these environments are subjected to drastic environmental changes. In spite of these extreme conditions, estuaries can be 6 times as productive in producing food materials as the most fertile farmland. Thus, it is not surprising that these special environments possess unbelievable biological richness and diversity. In this program, we will examine the fascinating world of estuaries and discover how life has adapted to the unusual conditions which occur in them. Tillamook Bay on the coast of Oregon demonstrates all of the features of a typical temperate climate estuary. To the left, we can see the rough breakers of the Pacific Ocean. And to the right, the relatively calm waters of the bay. A narrow peninsula of land called a sand spit separates the 2 bodies of water except at the narrow mouth of the bay. In the range of coastal mountains off in the distance, rivers form as clouds of evaporated seawater condense on their cool slopes. 5 of these rivers enter Tillamook Bay, and in this special ecosystem, fresh and salt water are mixed together. At high tide, the bay is mostly filled with salty water. At low tide, the bay contains primarily fresh water. During periods of low tide, mudflats are exposed through which temporary freshwater rivulets flow. The mudflats are formed when silt and organic material from the land are carried downstream by the rivers and are deposited on the floor of the bay. Although the mudflats seem flat and uninteresting, they actually teem with many exotic life forms that seek protection below the surface during periods of low tide. Many estuaries of this sort also possess vast swampy areas containing salt-tolerant marsh grasses, which provide shelter for many types of animal life. Estuaries take numerous forms because they are shaped by unique combinations of rivers, land, and sea, and are very different biologically according to climate. One distinct type of estuarine environment common in tropical regions is the mangrove lagoon. As this river flows down from the hills, it collects fresh water along the way. Upon entering a flat lowland region, the river splits up into many smaller streams and forms enormous swamps. This swampy region, containing a dense growth of salt-tolerant trees called mangroves, signals the entry into tidal waters, where salt and fresh water combine. Even at the edge of the bay, mangroves send their roots down through mud and sand, extracting fresh water from the salt water they live in. Mangroves drop their spear-like seed pods into the mud, and new trees readily germinate from them. The thick growth of mangrove trees provides protection from the pounding surf, and as a result, dense populations of animals can be found living in these lagoons. These snowy egrets feed on the abundant fish and shellfish which thrive among the mangrove roots. Because the water level of an estuary rises and falls twice a day with the fluctuations of the tides, bottom-dwelling animals are subjected to large changes in temperature, salinity, environmental moisture, and oxygen availability. These tides that ebb and flow with great precision are created by a combination of the gravitational pull of the moon and the rotation of the earth. High tides occur directly below the moon and at the exact place on the opposite side of the earth. Thus, when maximum high tide occurs along the longitude upon which Los Angeles exists, a simultaneous high tide will be occurring along the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Likewise, those areas at exact right angles to the Los Angeles longitude, such as the east coast of Australia and the Azores Island in the mid-Atlantic, will be experiencing maximum low tides. Tides exist because the pull of gravity creates a bulge in the ocean nearest the moon and draws the surface of the earth away from the ocean on the opposite side of the planet. And because the earth rotates on its axis, periods of high and low tide follow one another every quarter rotation or 6 hours. When the moon and sun are at right angles to the earth, that is, during a half moon, gravitational pull is least and changes in tidal levels are smallest. When sun, moon, and earth are lined up as they are during the new moon and full moon, gravitational forces are greatest, producing large tides when water levels change drastically. During low tides, estuary waters rush out to sea, creating an ebb current. But during high tides, the ocean waters of the flood current flow inland. Very high tides can bring salty water far up the rivers flowing into a bay, and consequently, an estuary includes those regions of a river which are only periodically subjected to seawater. Salt water travels along the bottom of the Mississippi River as distant as 150 miles upstream, making it possible to find saltwater fish far from the Gulf of Mexico. And yet, the top of the river remains fresh and is home to water striders and whirligig beetles. The force of the incoming tide colliding with flowing river water produces a turbulent mixing of air and water in estuaries, resulting in a higher oxygen content in estuarine waters than in the open ocean. This increased oxygen content allows for an abundance of aquatic life forms. It is not surprising, therefore, that estuaries can contain dense populations of fish, and in consequence, all the animals dependent on fish for food are always present in estuaries, including many types of birds and aquatic mammals such as seals, dolphins, and even whales. Estuaries, whether consisting of the cool waters of Tillamook Bay or the warm waters of a tropical mangrove lagoon, are much richer in the microorganisms which make up plankton than either the open ocean or freshwater rivers. Planktonic or free-floating organisms and organic debris washed into the bay by rivers provide the basic source of food for the animals who live on the bottom of the bay. Many of these bottom-dwelling animals are found only in estuary environments, and it is undoubtedly these bottom dwellers who predominate there. They belong to a number of different animal phyla, and most are filter feeders who strain the water to obtain food. They've had to develop different strategies for survival, since during low tides, large portions of the bottom of the bay are exposed directly to the drying effects of wind and sun. And even though they are exposed to the air, mudflats are actually oxygen poor due to the activity of the bacteria which consume oxygen as they decompose the organic debris which collects on the mudflats. This mud usually contains a high concentration of sulfides, produced as a byproduct of bacterial processes which can cause it to release an unpleasant odor. In spite of all this, bottom-dwelling creatures have adapted to life in this unlikely habitat. If we look at the surface of a tidal mudflat, we see that it is covered with innumerable tiny craters. Each crater indicates an animal concealed below the surface. Here they wait, protected by moist mud and sand, for the incoming tide, which brings with it food and oxygen. An eruption of water through a crater is a good sign that a clam, one of the commonest bottom dwellers, is headed for safety deep below the surface. Clams are bivalves, or two-shelled mollusks, and can exist in fantastic numbers in estuaries. It is interesting to catch a clam. The type is called a cockle. Place it in a shallow pool of water and watch how it buries itself in the sand. At first, the shell is tightly closed for protection. After a short time of being undisturbed, the shell will open slightly. Normally, clams dwell in the bay mud and extend pairs of tubular siphons up through the surface into the water. Clams filter the water passing through the siphons for particles of food, and at the same time extract oxygen for respiration. The clam can pump water through its siphons and create a kind of jet propulsion system used for burrowing. A process aided by the use of a large fleshy foot. Not all of the craters found on tidal flats are formed by clams. Some conceal worms from a number of different phyla. Most belong to the same phylum as the common earthworm called the Annelida, or segmented worms. Some, like this clam worm, can be found living in clam burrows. Others, like feather duster worms, are tube-dwelling annelids which possess feathery tentacles used to trap food particles and pass them by the action of cilia into their mouths. The bottoms of bays are sometimes thick with forests of these worms. Here we see how the tentacles of a Terabella worm can be spread over a great distance in an active search for food. One rather rare and unusual worm occasionally encountered is the sipunculid, or peanut worm. It can swallow great quantities of mud and sand, from which it extracts organic material. When removed from its burrow, it will alternately extend and pull back one end of its body, to which a ring of tentacles is attached. The worm-like cusk eel is a type of bony fish also found living in clam burrows, where it waits for unsuspecting prey. Organisms like the clam, cusk eel, and clam worm, which share dwellings without harming one another, are called commensals. Certain joint-legged invertebrates, such as this nearly transparent ghost shrimp, also can be found sharing burrows with clams. Ghost shrimps can exist in such great numbers in certain bays that oyster farmers consider them pests because they can disturb the oyster beds. Oyster farming is an interesting activity often encountered in estuaries. Oyster farmers place old oyster shells which contain immature oyster larvae into the bay, where they are allowed to grow for several years before being harvested. Like clams, oysters are bivalve mollusks, but their shells are oddly twisted depending on how crowded they were as they grew. An especially unusual feature of oysters is that they change sexes. One year they are male, and the next female. Scallops are another common type of bay-dwelling mollusk. Between Between this scallop's two shells can be seen rows of finger-like sensory devices. And between them are spherical eyes. When a predator such as a starfish comes near, the scallop can sense the approach chemically and will slam its shells together, causing water to be expelled so rapidly it can actually leap out of danger. Estuaries also contain bottom-dwelling members of the phylum Cnidaria. Among these organisms are burrowing sea anemones and sea pens. Sea pens have the property of bioluminescence and will give off a flash of brilliant orange light if disturbed in the dark. Some estuaries contain unbelievable numbers of bottom-dwelling crabs. Immature crabs can be found by turning over almost any moist rock in Tillamook Bay. The tiny crabs congregate under rocks during low tide to keep moist and to protect themselves from hordes of hungry birds. It is not surprising, therefore, that estuaries provide excellent sites for commercial crabbing operations. As we have seen, due to the fact that their water possesses a high oxygen content and abundant plankton, estuaries support rich populations of animals from many diverse phyla. In fact, estuaries are considered to be the most biologically productive habitats on Earth. But because estuaries are the final emptying place of rivers, they are especially susceptible to water pollution upstream. Solid pollutants and chemicals settle on the tidal mudflats, destroying shellfish by the billions. Chesapeake Bay, the largest estuary system in the United States, has suffered near total destruction of its once rich oyster beds as a result of water pollution. Cities on estuaries still continue to drain and fill biologically rich wetlands to create new land upon which to build. But today, new laws are being implemented to protect these extraordinary environments so that all of the rare and wonderful life forms which live within their sheltered boundaries may survive and flourish, to provide a source of abundant food and natural beauty for the coming generations of human beings.